Hey everyone, I'm super excited about this Weaviate podcast. We have LangChain founder Harrison Chase and Weaviate CEO and co-founder Bob Van Light. So guys, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks, man. Looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks for having me, you guys. Really excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, I'm just so excited to dive into it. Harrison, could we start with the story of like the origin story of LangChain, like how you created this?
Yeah, I mean, it started really kind of innocently and innocuously. I was just chatting with everyone's into language models these days. Everyone's building applications, and so when I first started chatting with folks, and this is back in like September, October, people were still into it, not to the extent they are today, but there was a lot of people playing around and messing around and building applications. And I chatted with a bunch of them at meetups. I had some friends building stuff. Sam Whitmore, shout out to her, was building an awesome application, and so really got to like know them and chat with them about their use cases. And basically just saw like a few common kind of like abstractions, things that were happening, factored those out, put those in a Python package, very kind of like just engineer, factor stuff out, put it in there and put it out there. Put it out to the world and got a positive response. And so kept on adding stuff in, kept on refactoring as, the abstractions that I thought I first saw were of course wrong. And so those kind of like evolved over time. But yeah, basically just started off by chatting with a bunch of folks and pulling out common abstractions into a Python package.
Brilliant. Maybe so we could start with kind of maybe the first abstraction that helped me understand LangChain was kind of the sequential chains. Like, you have the output of the language model is the input to the next call to the language model. Could we maybe start with describing the sequential chains?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. The idea of chaining is basically breaking up calls to language models in multiple steps, and not only calls to language models but to other things actually. And so I think actually most of the examples that I first added were like language model, and then other thing, and then language model, and basically chaining the results of them together in a way where you did some iterative stuff. And so to make this concrete with an example, one of the things that I first added was based on a paper by Offer Press, self-ask with search. So basically, you'd ask a question, and the examples in this paper were kind of like multi-hop questions. So it wasn't just like a simple answer. And these are cases where language models are known to kind of like not perform super well. And so the self-ask with search paradigm is you first kind of like think about what intermediate questions you need to answer. So I think like the example used in the paper is like, what is the hometown of the current U.S. Open champion? And so like if we're thinking about that intuitively, like what would we do as humans? First, we'd think about who the current U.S. Open champion is, and then we'd figure out where his hometown is. And so basically, the idea of chaining was to break those down into exactly those steps. So the language model should hopefully know that it first needs to think about who the current U.S. Open champion is, figure that out, and then it needs to think about where he's from and figure that out. And you could do that with a single pass of a language model. The thing that's interesting and the thing that caught my attention was basically the idea of combining the language model with Google search. Because if you're asking about the current US Open champion, the language model, which was trained on data up to 2021 or something like that, wouldn't know the information. And so basically, you use a language model to ask the intermediate question. You then pass that question to a search API. You get back a result, and then you basically keep on going from there. And so the idea of chaining that really stuck out. And this is a little bit different than the sequential chains that you brought up, but I think it's more interesting, to be honest. So I think it's the idea of chaining language models to determine to figure out what information they need to look up, getting that information from a separate, more accurate, more reliable, more up to date source, and then plugging that back in and letting it continue on its merry way.
Oh yeah, incredible. And Bob and I recorded our Generate module podcast, and maybe Bob, you could hop in more on sort of just how you're seeing this kind of language model calling the search database, and from Google search to Weaviate search.
Yeah, it's so funny that you bring it up because that's exactly what I wanted to say. Because there were like these two things. Sometimes you have like these multiple things coming together, right? So one is exactly when you started with LangChain. I was looking into like, so what is he doing? And it's like, oh, I got it. And then there was also that article that I was like, when people say like, okay, hey, we can hook this up to Google search. I was like, you can also hook it up to a vector search engine, right? And do this stuff with your own data. So that was why I was so super, I was super excited about, about what you're working on, Harrison, because I was like, this is like just a beautiful synergy of all these things coming together where we really use natural language to or create a change, or have the database for like large amounts of data. And that's just I had the exact same. I was looking at the exact same thing, and when I saw hooking it up to Google Search, and I don't remember, Connor, I think you shared that first article with me, but when I saw that, I was like, yes, that's what we can do. And then everything came together, and then you started with LangChain, and we were looking at what we could do there. It was just super, super exciting. So I had the exact same thing.
And to your point, Bob, like I think it's more interesting to hook it up to your Weaviate database or your own internal data, because that's just more like unique to you and that's more distinct to you. Like anyone can hook it up to Google Search, right? Anyone can hook it up to Wolfram Alpha, but like your documents, your data that are in your vector database, your Weaviate database, connecting it with that, like that, I think allows you to build like a differentiated and unique kind of like chat bot or question answering or whatever kind of like experience.
Exactly, and I think why it's interesting to do that with like new types of vector databases like Weaviate, or for that matter also Wolfram, right? So it is that it has this natural language interface. So and when I recorded the podcast with together with Connor, so while we're recording, we have not released the module yet, but when this podcast sees the light of day, it people will know about it, right? So the is that we're moving towards a how should I say, to a way of interacting with the database, not with like precise queries and precise answers. Like you need to have a keyword that matches in your database versus a result that you're getting from the database that must be stored in the database. But we can just have free associations with our database, and we can even generate different results based on the tasks or the prompts that we're giving to our data. And I think that's just super exciting. I just talking about it and thinking about it just makes me like super exciting for the coming year. It's gonna be a cool year.
Yeah, I think like this natural language layer on top of like whether it's a vector database or a structured SQL database or a Mongo database, any of that, I think that's really like powerful and really interesting because it allows like people who don't know SQL or don't know how to write GraphQL to interact with these databases. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to see this kind of like unlock a lot of new people using this stuff across a variety of use cases.
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah, that's something that I thought was so exciting when I first saw LangChain is how the language model can control the database, like you just said, with the writing the GraphQL queries out or writing the SQL queries, writing graph database queries. So can we talk about that kind of orchestration layer where you say tell the language model, hey, you have like in Weaviate land, you have this class, you have this class, you have this class. This class contains like Weaviate blog posts, this documentation, this is the code base, and so it like chooses which information source to traverse. And maybe you can also talk about like SQL or like the Google Search API or just other APIs, like all sorts of external data sources and how that's interfaced in LangChain.
Yeah, I think I'll maybe start with just a SQL database example because I think that's maybe one that most people are familiar with. But the ideas are common across other types of databases, whether structured or unstructured or vector or anything like that. And I'll start with like a simple example, but I think we'll see pretty quickly that it starts to get pretty complex. Okay, so at the most like simple example, the pipeline is basically you take in a natural language query, you then generate relevant SQL, and I'll come back to that in a little bit, but you generate relevant SQL, you then execute that SQL against the database, you get back the result, and then you pass that to the language model if desired, and kind of like return like a human interpretable answer. And so yeah, like I think the example that we have in the documentation is like, how many employees exist. And so it like does like, it gets like the count of the number of rows in the employee table and then returns something to the user, like there are 9 employees or something like that. Touching on the first part, like generating the relevant SQL query, as you were getting at, there's a lot of information that you actually need to put in to kind of do that correctly. So you need to kind of like put in information about all the tables that exist, and then not only the tables but the columns as well. And if there are relationships between those columns, you need to input those as well. And so the prompt that you're constructing starts to get pretty complicated already. And so a lot of the value that LangChain provides is ways to like easily construct these prompts and then also like just like see what's going on. Like this is a complicated prompt, I'm already describing it, I already probably lost half the audience. And so like making it like really easy to see like what's going on and what it actually looks like. Okay, so that's like the simple use case, but there are a lot of like complexities. So what if there are just like too many tables and too many rows and or sorry too many columns in those tables to put into the prompts because there are contexts kind of like window length. What do you do then? And so one another chain that we have in LangChain is basically a chain that first selects relevant tables and then puts only those tables in the prompt. And so kind of like a simple idea, but basically the idea of like filtering down. um, so that's around like constructing the query. Then after like executing the query, what if the query is like incorrect syntax? What if it's kind of like references tables that don't exist? What do you do then? And so I think there's a few things that to be honest, aren't in LangChain yet. They might be by the time this gets released. I think they're on our roadmap. One is the concept of kind of like output parsing or validators or guardrails. So like validating that things are valid SQL syntax and stuff like that. Another idea is basically the idea of kind of like if it tries and it fails, just like passing that back to the language model and letting it learn from its mistakes. There's a really good example of this working from Riley Goodside with not with SQL but with like a Python example where he asks it to do a math problem. It tries to use like the math module, but it's not imported. And so if you allow it to kind of like correct its errors, it will see like import error, math not recognized, and then it will kind of like fix it the next time around. And so I think like things like that for SQL, for any type of database querying will be important as well. Um, yeah, so I think that's an overview of kind of like what's in LangChain currently and like stuff that we want to add because yeah, it gets a little complex a little quickly.
Just out of curiosity to build on top of that, right? So the because the focus now is mostly that you have like on language, right? LangChain. How do you what do you think when it comes to like these multi-modal kind of models, right? So how what do you think will happen there, and how will LangChain potentially evolve with these kinds of models? But or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think okay, so at the simple answer is there's basically kind of like integrations we can already do, and there actually already are PRs for this to kind of like hook up kind of like multimodal things on either end of the language model. So, for example, like take an audio file, transcribe it, generate some stuff, generate some text. That's done by kind of like converting it into the text domain. So. Yeah, so in that sense it's somewhat multimodal but it's not like fully multimodal. Another example of this kind of like quasi thing is like hooking it up to an image api or something. So there is a pr open to basically have a chain that first like takes in like because all the image prompts are like really convoluted, like that's like wizardry right there. So take in kind of like a simpler query, generate a more convoluted prompt, pass it to dolly or something, get back an image. So in that sense, I think there will shortly be kind of like multimodal support in LangChain. More involved than that, honestly, I don't know at the moment. I think I know there have been a lot of more kind of like first class multimodal models coming out, and so I think we need to look a little bit more carefully about how to integrate those.
Yeah, so the thinking is like you would have an image captioning model that parses the image into text, and then it just easily flows into the text interface of ChatGPT. Is that mostly?
Yeah, that's kind of how we're imagining things. That would be easiest for the current kind of like construction of LangChain for sure. And so I think that's what we'll do first.
Yeah, I think that's such an exciting emerging thing of the like the multimodal ChatGPT style large vision language model. I think that is definitely on the horizon. I would, if I had to take a guess, I'd say that's within 3 months.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm excited to play around with it. I think Character AI has done some like multimodal stuff as well. I think they have some multimodal chatbots. So yeah, excited to see it more widespread.
Oh, I just quickly say, yeah, I saw it like DeepMind's Flamingo at NeurIPS is that already.
Yeah, I just it's like by matter of like a thought experiment. So the other day I was thinking about the following, right? So what I noticed, and that's something we are doing also with Weaviate, and maybe that's also happening for like what you're working on, Harrison, is that um, I was thinking somehow we try to capture these things in like a traditional way of a software engineer, right? So we say, okay, how do we write the technology to and then we get stuff back, and then we get these complex chains in your case, or in our case, like how will we represent the data? I was, if we just think about like 2 3 years from now, could it be the case that we just interact with like software completely different because of these LLMs? And what we're doing today. So to give you a very pragmatic example, the first time I interacted with a generative model, so quite some time ago, I needed to get used to the fact that I was not writing software, so that I just could use natural language to give it an assignment that felt so unnatural to me, right? So I'm just curious. I actually both of you how you guys see this, because I have like a feeling that we're still trying to shoehorn this into a traditional way of writing software, but that maybe in like a year, 2 years from now, that's just a completely different paradigm in how we create technology, and or how we interact with the database, or how we chain things together. I'm just curious what you guys think about that. If you just kind of dream into the future what this might look like.
Yeah, I I think I mean, it's a really good question, right? Like that's like I think the UX for all these things is kind of like what people are talking about. I don't have any great answers. I think like one thing that I mean, kind of like in the vein of like, and this is a bit more on the like developer side of things, but on like the vein of like multimodal stuff, like I think like right now a lot of the stuff that like when we're talking about ingesting data, right, for like PDFs, like right now we're transforming a PDF into like some text and then maybe like embedding that text or something like that, or transforming, yeah, doing like a caption on an image and embedding that caption or something like that. I think a lot of stuff will move towards just being like talking to each other in like embedding space basically, and translating between that. Um, but yeah, that's kind of a little bit separate than what you were asking. I don't I mean, okay, so here's what I'll say around like the UX of actual products. I think they'll start to be like, look at Copilot. Like, why does Copilot like work as kind of like a product? It works because it's in a situation where you don't need 100% accuracy. There's a human in the loop, um, and yeah, it's a bit, it's kind of like working with you. And so I think like the common thing for products has been like Copilot for X, Copilot for X. And I think like the important part is like, it's people are still getting used to working with these language models. The language models still aren't at like 99% accuracy or even close to that. So you need kind of this human in the loop and this like situations where it's okay to have lower accuracy. I think as language models get better and we get more familiar, we'll start to see more applications where there's less human in the loop and they're more automated, and they're in situations where you can have like higher accuracy, or sorry, yeah, where you can get higher accuracy, where you need higher accuracy, and it starts to unlock that. So yeah, I don't have any great insights as to what the future will look like, but I think that is like one kind of like natural progression that we'll see.
Yeah, exactly. Because I was also thinking about this, and I was trying to think back of like the how Weaviate, like the origins of it, and I remember that I had like this epiphany moment when I was at a conference, and people were talking about the semantic web, and that there was like that some people in the audience were like annoyed because we humans couldn't agree on stuff, right? So how we were structuring the data, and that this whole thing of these language models, not even large language but just language models in general, right, back then it was just law, fast text, etc., that people started to think about, what if we don't have to do that anymore? And I think if you now, for example, fast forward to today, so for example, let's say that Connor and I, that we're working on a piece of code, right, and I make a mistake and say, hey Connor, it's not what mistake did I make? And Connor looks at it and says, oh, you forgot like a semicolon or something. That I could imagine that we're moving towards a space where you're almost running like pseudocode, but that the model says, "Oh no, I got you. I know what you want to do. I'll just execute it." Right? I see where you're going, and I would not be surprised that we just get to a natural language state of programming, which of course will come with certain rules and certain UX elements. I was listening to a podcast from the open what's the name, open source data podcast from Sam Ramsey, and he was interviewing Ben Lorca, and then Ben also said like, how will we get the rigor of software engineering into working with these language models? And I find that just super interesting, because if we're if we and then we like humanity will figure out how to do that, then it will become easier for people to interact with these models, but also write technology software. Right, so you just describe what you want, and the model helps you to deploy it, to develop it. I would not be surprised that we will see things based on also what you're working on, Harrison. That there will be like deploy a complex infrastructure by just describing it in natural language, and then the model figures out, oh, then I need to spin up a pod here, and I need to do this over there, and those kind of things, right? Or design, that you just have visual design, you just describe it, and then it goes like, okay, gotcha, and it just figures that out. So I really hope that it also lowers the barrier for even more people to just write software and just create cool things. And I would not be surprised in like a year, 2 years from now, we're slowly moving towards well, a natural language way of describing what we want the machines to do, and then they just, in combination with this model, they just figure it out and just do it.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of talk around like prompt engineering. Like, it is prompt engineering here to last? Like, my take is it will kind of like converge to like what you're describing. Like, just as you would tell a human how to do something, you'll have to tell the language model how to do something. And so this, to your point around this natural language interface for doing something, like, yeah, I think that's pretty realistic that we can get there.
No, yeah, that kind of like I think I really like the example that Harrison brought earlier. Quickly, I want to come back to that about like with the SQL code, how you check if it's correct, kind of, and it makes it like I'm so excited about this idea of like the language model would write code to run experiments, like run the experiments and then analyze the experiments. Could maybe kind of step into the technical and like how will this look? How will it check the correctness and then flow in the LangChain uh, syntax?
Yeah, and I mean, Copilot had a really cool demo of this at one of the Microsoft conferences where they asked it to write a problem, and then it kind of like they ran it. You could see the output. It realized that the output, it wasn't even that. I don't think it ran into any like compile issues or something. It ran successfully, but the output was just like nonsensical, and so it like logically reasoned that there must be a mistake somewhere in like the program. So I don't know how. I actually don't know how kind of like Copilot did that, but I would imagine the way that I think like I think the best way, I think hard coding, like, oh, check if error, check this. I think that is doomed for failure, because I think that's just, you're going to run into too many edge cases. And so I think actually the right way to go about this, and the way that people will go about this in the future, is basically telling the language model that it can take these actions. It can write code, it can run code, it can observe output of code, or I guess in the case of SQL, it can write SQL, it can run SQL, it can observe the output of SQL, it can check SQL query or something like that, and then basically let it determine like what actions it should take. So first it should write some code, then it should run the code, then it needs to look at the output, and then it determines, okay, do I need to like edit the code, do I need to run it again, can I return it to the user? And so basically, like, yeah, I think the control flow will kind of like be determined by the language model, but then it just has access to all these like tools or actions, whatever you want to call them, where it can do certain things. But it's not hard coded that like you do this, then you do this, then you do this. I just think that will not enable the types of like yeah, the types of experiences that are needed for these more kind of like complex workflows.
Yeah, because I think what Bob was saying earlier with the idea of you spin up a pod and it knows how to monitor the production app. And like I haven't didn't know too much about this until I joined Weaviate and got under the curtain and saw the things that happen. And it's like that idea of the language model keeping the software running with all the errors that come up. That is just amazing. I think.
Yeah, exactly. And to build on top of that, so I'm just curious to see if we will go to a world where, so as you're describing it, Harrison, I think that will, of course, be like the short term, not even tomorrow, like right now. Like we describe something, what we see with Copilot, right? We describe a problem, it outputs SQL, and then it gets whatever it needs from the database, right? But I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to skip that middle step at some point. So let's take Weaviate as an example. There's no reason why Weaviate couldn't have like a SQL interface. We don't have that, but you could theoretically have that. That if you just have like a situation where it's like, okay, we have like, this is how the embeddings are encoded on disk or in memory and those kind of things, and then the model just knows where to get it. And that we get just new systems that would just interact with them based on that. It just knows where the information is, and it just figures that out by just telling it in the prompt, right? So literally prompt engineering, like, this is how the database is structured, this is how we store the vectors and the data in memory or on disk, do your thing, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if you see it, maybe not tomorrow, but like, I would be surprised if very soon we will see the first maybe research or blog posts and people experimenting with this. So just to cut out the middleman, basically, where the middleman is the interface language, like right, like SQL or those kind of things. Because the problem is that these interfaces, they force us to be extremely hyper structured, which is understandable and which is great for many use cases. But what if you can just skip that altogether? Because the way that we're now interfacing with each other, right? I'm not formatting my questions or my remarks in a certain way. Then I go like, okay, I hope that Connor can parse what I'm saying right now, right? I just use language, and then it just and I really hope that that is where we can go based on these embedding based and language model based approaches. That's, I mean, this is a little bit further in the future, but I really hope that we can get there. With all these tools and what everybody's working on.
Yeah, so Harrison, can I ask about some of the prompts that you like the most? Like maybe like let's think step by step. The idea of you are the writer, you are the editor, you are the reviewer. Like, have any of these prompts really stood out to you as being really interesting?
Yeah, I think the ones that are most interesting to me are the ones that are basically good at interacting with arbitrary external kind of like tools. And so what I mean by that is like interacting with like external tools and thinking about how to like reason with tools. There's a really good paper called React, which is like synthesizing, reasoning, and acting, and basically it combines kind of like some of the chain of thought stuff, which is where you kind of like ask the language model to kind of like think slowly about what it. You basically tell it to think, which sounds silly, but you tell it to think. And then acting is like determining kind of like what action to take and what action and what input to that kind of like action or tool to be. And so combining them, it kind of I think the paper showed some pretty nice gains and a bunch of benchmarks and stuff like that. So that type of prompting is really interesting to me because I think having the language model act as kind of like a conductor that can interact with things is very powerful. And so any type of prompting that enables that, I really like. Now taking like the zero shot kind of like thing to that. So the original paper kind of like hard coded a bunch of few shot examples. So they gave it a bunch of so I think like in the original paper, one of the examples was interacting with like the Wikipedia client, and so it could do like a search, it could do like a lookup. I think those were the two actions it could do. It gave a bunch of examples of it doing those actions, and then it learned from those examples. And so to the point earlier about like prompt engineering kind of going the way of you just tell it what to do, like I think the way that it will be in the future is you won't necessarily have to give it those examples. You can just tell it like this is what you can do. And so the zero shot way of interacting with tools is exactly that. There's no examples. You just kind of say, hey, you have access to this tool. It's called search. It takes as input a string. And what it does is it look and you should use it for like current events and stuff like that. And then you do that with however many tools you have, and it kind of just like learns to use them in a zero shot way. And the React prompting is really powerful for this because it lets it like think about like all the information it has, like the tool name and the tool description and stuff like that. And I find this really cool. And I think like one, it like works surprisingly well just out of the box. And then the other like really fun thing is that if it's not working, it's kind of easy to tweak by just like changing the description of the tool. So one of the common questions I get asked is like, how can I like, it's using this tool incorrectly, or like, how can I get it to use this tool in this specific scenario? And it sounds stupid, but the answer is you just tell it to, like, you just tell the language model, like, use this when you have a question about math, use this when you have a question about music. And it's generally pretty good at like observing that and following those instructions. And so that type of like zero shot React prompting that's by far the most interesting stuff to me, I think.
Very exciting, very exciting. I just want to highlight one more time that when you said like you just tell it to, that is just how far we got. Like in like just think about 2 years ago, right? It's that is just that one sentence there. You just tell it. That was like how exciting that is. I love that.
Yep. Yeah. All in all the papers, a lot of the papers that came out in this were from like even like a year ago when you needed few shot examples and you couldn't just tell it to, and you had to do this like really elaborate prompt engineering. And now you just kind of like tell it to. And there's still like, again, like I don't think this means that there's no need for prompt engineering. Like you still have to like figure out how to like, you still have to construct the prompt in a certain way, and you still have to tell it like what scenarios it's good for and stuff like that. But it's a lot easier too, and it's just like it's more similar to just chatting with a human and instructing a human.
Yeah, I think maybe playing the devil's advocate here, I think kind of the you just tell it to is maybe like I think the whole thing about prompt engineering is that there is a little bit of an art to telling it, right? Like, and so I'm really curious about this intersection between like you could sample many decodings from the large language model, that temperature thing being like the key knob that you can slide. Maybe firstly to set the stage, what do you think about that temperature parameter on the large language models?
I think if I'm so I think there's two different like ways to use language models, I would say. One is like leveraging their like reasoning ability, and their ability to like, yeah, take ambiguity and decipher it and decide what to do. And this comes into a lot of the action stuff. And then the other is generating text, right? Generating prose, generating poems. So for the latter, for like generating text, yeah, crank the temperature up, like get some like funky responses, go for it. But for like the part where you want to like reason about things, I almost always set like temperature to zero, and just because you want the single kind of like you want the best, most accurate response.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because the what we're also seeing with the database, right? So and Connor and I coincidentally earlier today had a conversation about that. That what I really believe is like you have like the reasoning aspect of the model, and then in our case also the database, right? So Weaviate that you can say, okay, we're gonna literally in prompt engineering, you tell it like we're gonna give you information in this format, and you must base your answer on the information we're giving it. And if you can't, tell us you can't, and then temperature all the way to zero. You know what I mean? And I find it very interesting because what that means is that you're kind of cutting out, and I'm air quoting it, the knowledge that is in the model, but you keep it to the language understanding. Like as if you have like a human who just understands everything you're saying but has no knowledge and has like an old set of encyclopedias, and then you go like, okay, what's the distance from Earth to the moon? And okay, let I understand the question. Let me find that in the encyclopedia, and I find that very intriguing. And I'm curious. I have a question for you about this, Harrison. So um, there are like two camps, right? That we see. Like one is like we're gonna keep fine tuning the model until it has all the knowledge, right, for whatever use case we have, or we're gonna just keep that separation that we say like these. We have the model and we just feed it with data coming from a data source. I'm just curious where I mean I have strong opinions on this, but I'm very curious where you sit on this. No, what your angle is and what your take is on these approaches.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, I think there's like a place and time for both. I don't think that one's kind of like strictly better than the other. I think the one that's more interesting to me is kind of like the one that you combine with external data. I think, but like if we think about that language model as kind of like acting as a decision maker or a router, one of the things that it could route to is a larger language model that is trained on everything, and it could call that like when it needs to. But yeah, I think the idea of well, okay, so yeah, the idea of fine tuning on everything and always trying to make sure the language model is up to date. I'm not very bullish on that. I do think there's a place for like general purpose language models, but as I said, I'd rather use that as like a tool rather than trying to like have that be the sole source of everything. Um, and then yeah, like combining data with language models. I think there's I mean even today you can do that with prompt engineering. There's some like really interesting papers on like kind of like ways to do it at a more kind of like more native to the model. So where you're actually attending over embeddings of documents that you pull. So like retro style approaches. I don't think there are any great publicly available models for that yet, but that might be something that comes out in the next year or two that would be really interesting. Um, and then yeah, the idea of having like the language model act as a router. One thing that like, I would love to have like a fine tuned model that's just really good at zero shot kind of like routing and reasoning. And I'm actually chatting with a few folks by this, so I don't know when this is coming out. So it's possible that when this comes out, we'll have some like yeah we'll have already shared some stuff about that. But like I think creating that like small fine tuned model really good at zero shot reasoning would be really really cool. And so Yeah, that's kind of that's the type of fine tuning that I'm interested in. I'm not interested in kind of like the fine tuning to make it kind of like up to date with every possible information that's under the sun. I'm more interested in kind of like the fine tuning to have it do routing to other sources of information.
Yeah, I like that very much. So I have a very similar point of view. So I would not be surprised if we're going to see these kind of models that are just that indeed are like good at like general purpose things, like an LLM for medical terminology, an LLM for legal terminology, an LLM for engineering, those kind of things, but that it is very good at just processing basically these one-shot approach, right? That you mentioned, that it understands, like, for lack of a better term, so it understands, it can help you reason what kind of data that it needs to get from, in this case, a database or any data source that you give it. So it's interesting to say that because I have a very similar point of view. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I used to really like this idea of like you would maybe have some kind of classifier that classifies the model in the Hugging Face Model Hub that's the best for this task. But so what will this all these large language models, the lawyer, the biomedical language model, how do you see like how will that be organized?
First of all, I don't think anyone knows, which makes this so exciting. Um, I think, yeah, I mean, like, I don't know. Right now, the private models are way better than the open source models. Like, I think it's yeah, like GPT-3 is way better than the best open source models. Probably Flan T5, Anthropic when they come out with their model will probably be pretty good. Um, I think there, it's like it's possible that it's possible there will be a better open source model release. It's possible that, to your point around like having a model specifically for medical or specifically for law, maybe you can get that by fine tuning Flan T5, and it's less about kind of like maybe for like smaller, more narrow things like that. Actually, definitely for smaller, narrow things, you can probably get just as good performance by fine tuning Flan T5 or something like that. First, like it kind of just depends on like what small and narrow is, right? Like, is law like small and narrow? I would argue it's still kind of like big and out there, but it's definitely smaller than like every piece of knowledge under the sun. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess my current guess would be that they'll be like the private models will be the best general purpose ones. The open source models will be fine for smaller tasks, and I think probably over time, like the open source models will start catching up, and at the same time the private models will keep on getting better and better. So I think there'll always be this gap. It will just become like, what's in this gap? Is the real value in this gap, or is the real value now doable with like smaller fine-tuned models? And I don't know. I don't know how fast those will move up. A lot of questions.
Yeah, actually, now when you put it like that, I'll take back what I said before. So just I hope you can cut that out. No, I'm joking. But it just let one model. It's just one model to rule them all, and then maybe a few different providers with different, for different edge case. I don't know, but yeah. So this is what I meant. Like what I said, it's like this traditional mindset, right? So it's like we have different programming languages for different tasks, but like why not one model? That does make sense.
Yeah, I think the counter argument to that though would be like right now the inference is kind of expensive, like compared to if I train like an extractive QA model on my documentation, like I could even sparsify the question answering model. It maybe is only like 80 million parameters, and so it's just super fast. That would be kind of my counter argument to like the smaller fine tuned models for certain tasks, like in the search pipeline, like the re rank or like I see a lot of tweets that are like, "Oh, you can use the large language model to re-rank," and I'm like, "What a waste of the large like to re-rank." It's like kind of a
I think the paradigm, and there's a good quote from Stan from Dust, and so I'm going to shamelessly steal it here. But he has a great quote that's like, "No GPUs before PMF," which is basically like no GPUs, no fine tuning of models before PMF, product market fit, before you know what you're doing. And I think like the power of large language models is that they're so good at just like arbitrary tasks, and you can get them to do like basically whatever. And so experimenting with like different pipelines or different things that you're doing is really it's so much easier than before. And so I think the common thing will basically be like, experiment with the best models, Then when you actually get something that's like working and you want to scale it up, not even that's like what, like when it's working and it's just for you, it's probably fine. But when you want to like scale it up, then you need to worry about like fine tuning models. And so I think it's also kind of like a progression as well. Like, if I was building an application, I would never start with I would never start with fine tuning. No, I'd start with the language model, and then I'd start with the biggest language model, GPT-3 or something like that. And then um, when I get to the point where I have enough confidence that I need to scale it up, then I'd start thinking about that. And I think that'll be like a pretty common workflow. And I've already seen a few people, and yeah, I've already seen a few people like doing that. It's not that crazy, right? So.
No, I just want to say that's very interesting, and especially with what you said with PMF, right? With product market fit, it's like there's this tipping point of like with the models being the general purpose models are good enough to solve the task, right? So it just and we're hitting that tipping point. I found it fascinating to what we saw the last few weeks, the discussions on Twitter and what have you, and in newspapers. I was just sitting on the side eating popcorn while I was watching it, right? Of seeing like core research, but also like product people working in this space, how they look at this very differently, right? So it's like, and I think that is for me in my profession, one of the breakthroughs of ChatGPT was not only using the model to do it, but also the packaging. Like it's so simple if you think about it, but it's so well executed, and that kind of ties into what you were saying, Harrison. That it is it we're just past the tipping point that where you can build amazing stuff, like for example, taking LangChain, right, and solve your problem, or store your data in Weaviate and vectorize it just start searching and doing whatever you want to do. That just that has changed in the last year as opposed to a year before, and that is also why I said earlier, like I'll take back my what I said. It's like maybe it's just going to be like one model, right, or just a handful of models that are just good enough.
Yeah, awesome. So I kind of want to pivot topics and and ask Harrison a question about sort of the virality of LangChain, and the open source engagement has been something that's really been impressive. And so I just want to ask kind of like how like the question like how did you do this? How did you start the fire? Like, and obviously you're a really smart guy and the idea sticks like crazy, but yeah, like what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like honestly, I mean, one, it's just been like so much fun, and I think like that's the thing with like all these things. And I think Bob was saying like it's super easy to like create these things. Like it's just so much fun, and people have fun building these things, and I have fun building these things. And so it's just like I don't know. There's yeah, like I think there's just a lot of like energy and aspect of fun and just like building things and exploring. And so I don't think like yeah, like I think yeah, yeah, I don't think I haven't done anything like in particular. It's just been like a lot of fun. I think like yeah, I mean like the two things that I try to focus on besides just having fun, although they are like very related, are like build like actually useful things, and then like be nice as well. Like I think like, and that gets back into like having fun, right? Like I think like there really is just like everyone's like this is a great time to be hacking on like ideas and be exploring ideas, right? This is a phenomenal point in like I yeah, like I'm not that old, but like this is by far the best point in my lifetime for like exploring these types of ideas. And so and I think a lot of people realize that, and I think a lot of people are out there doing that. And so just like trying to build things that are actually useful for them, and then like like just being nice and having fun with people as they're doing it. Like I think yeah, no, that's all I really got. So
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think just like yeah, exactly like the contagiousness of sharing, oh, this prompt sequence created this is, yeah, and it is really truly amazing. So I'm kind of curious to see like the LangChain hub. So what are kind of the directions that you're thinking of taking LangChain in?
yeah, I mean, I think like the to your point around basically like sharing this prompt sequence sharing, that's exactly what LangChain Hub is designed to do. I think we put something out really quickly in like a GitHub repo where it's just a collection of kind of like chains and agents and prompts that you can easily load, and prompts you can't really use by themselves, but like chains and agents you can just easily load and use by themselves. Um, and I think despite it being a terrible UX as a like, GitHub repos are great, don't get me wrong, but they're not meant for like sharing and discoverability and stuff. And so like within a particular GitHub repo. So despite that terrible UX, like I think we saw a lot of people really interested in it. And so I think that's something that where, and I think like why are people interested in this? Because like there's just so many different things that you can do with them, and so like having them like and again going back to like the just like hacking and building and playing around, like there's definitely that type of like atmosphere, and a big part of that is like sharing your work, and so they're like not just LangChain is open source, but a lot of other really awesome projects built on top of it are open source. And so like the idea of like sharing, I think people really enjoy and like, and LangChain Hub is really just aimed at making it easy to share your chains, your agents, your prompts, stuff like that.
Yeah, so maybe yeah, like the open source thing is really fascinating. Like the how has kind of the maintenance been of it, as because I understand how many are you the sole maintainer, or how does that kind of thing happen?
Yeah, so there's one other person working on it full time with me. The maintenance costs have definitely gone up. I'm not gonna lie. I think there's like 110 GitHub issues and like 43 open PRs. So I've got to catch up on that a little bit for sure. But honestly, like I think it's been, but like but it's been like fun. Like it's like all the things that people are adding are like, like people are adding like different kinds of like embedding modules, different types of model providers. Like there's like that I hadn't even heard about, but like now I'm like, okay, I got to go check that out. Like different types of like vector stores, different types of chains, different types of tools to like interact with. And so I think like even though there's a lot of issues, I mean, and someone like opened up a PR for like some of like the image stuff, right? So it's like, I don't know, like even though there's a bunch of stuff, and there's a little bit of a backlog, which I need to fix right after this. But yeah, it hasn't been like too laborious to kind of like keep up with or anything like that. So.
Awesome. Well, fantastic, Harrison. I'll let you get back to it. I thought this was such an incredible, such an incredible podcast. I mean, yeah, the sequential chains is the first thing that just helped me instantly get it. So if listeners are out there wondering, checking LangChain out for the first time, the sequential chain of how you chain together multiple language model calls, one to the Weaviate vector database. And yeah, I think it's just such a fascinating library and seeing it emerge. So Harrison, thank you so much for your time and joining the Weaviate podcast.
No, thank you guys for having me. And yeah, just I don't know if people listening to this realize, but like Weaviate and you in particular, Connor, reached out super early on in the LangChain journey. Like I don't like it was yeah, like yeah, that was a while ago, and it's been awesome to kind of like work with you guys, and kind of like I think we both see the world in like similar ways, and there's like I think vector stores are like for a lot of applications are like a critical enabling piece. And so it's been awesome to work with you guys and chat about stuff. And so, yeah, thanks for having me on. Always happy to do it.
Yeah, thank you. It's super exciting, and we're here, here to help each other because it's just a whole new ecosystem. That's like it's like a supernova, like thanks to these LMs and like this whole new ecosystem. And we're just, I think we need to help each other, right, to reach our goals. And this is just, yeah, this is super exciting.